Well, I kind of prepared the lecture, and you know, when you go through the notes and you say, okay, maybe we have to have a more in-depth discussion and a challenging one than a lecture. And in a way, we started our dialogue with the faculty and the dean as to the root origins. And when we see the root origins of any conflict, I like to resort to an expression: the future starts yesterday. If you don't know the past, you are bound to repeat the mistakes of the past. Now, this is something that follows out throughout history. And those who know the past are on the top of the mountain. And they take the lead because they know the secrets that others don't have a clue about their connection. And that is true about all continents, all nations, because looking back at time is not just a matter of history. The relevance is so much there in our time that it's sometimes mind-boggling. When I look at our region, when I look at any region, and you think about conventional wisdom of our time, the first question is, of course, what leads to what? What happened that we have a conflict like World War I? That for us, for you, is history, for me is history. But I mean, 15, 20 years ago, we still had people who fought in World War I. And for them it was memory and a bitter lesson, personal lesson. So 100 years seems to be very, very much to an individual life, but 100 years in history of a nation is almost nothing. And 100 years in the context of history of the world, the history of any part of the world is really very, very minuscule. We are talking about the dinosaurs, 40 million, 50 million years. Remember how we talk about the past? That was 45 million years ago. And that was 42 million years ago. 3 million years is nothing. Imagine what does it mean for us today. And it reminds me a joke about us as individuals. When you owe $10,000 to the bank, it's your problem. When you owe $1 million to the bank, it's the bank's problem. So which means, $1 million, it's too much, so somebody else takes the issue. It's not within the individual grasp. I say that because if we want to understand the Middle East, that in kind of an ironic way, I call it the Muddle East politically, not the Middle East. That's copyrights reserved. I have to go into a very challenging story. How did we look like 100 years ago? To begin with, most of the nation states of the world never existed at that time. 100 years ago, you hardly had a bunch of nation states in the world. Namely, the national identity was not in existence. So what was there? What was in every corner of the world that today is marked by so many nations, the United Nations with 191 nation states, including Nauru with 9,000 people, a nation state in the United Nations, the equal vote to China with 1.5 billion people. Interesting, no? Take an island state of 9,000 people with equal rights in the United Nations to 1.5 billion people. Anyone knows how many people live in Iceland? Do you have a guess? 5. How many? 5 million? Iceland. A very strong name, very prominent in the world affairs. 350,000. You know what's the population of Denmark? 5 million. And what's the population of Switzerland? maybe 7 million. Very big names. Switzerland is giving us Rolex, giving us chocolate, giving us all the goodies. But these are 7 million people. Sweden, maybe 11, 12. Norway, 4.5. Very interesting. If you think about the context of a nation state and its presence in the global arena and its impact on the global arena, then we have 4.5 million people in Norway, that their impact on the world can be much bigger than 100 million people, 200 million. I say it because that was the world of the past. The past was marked by kingdoms and empires. And in the past, my dears, you were not equal rights citizens. In the past, you were subjects. And as subjects, your loyalty is to the ruler. And you serve the ruler doesn't serve you. And I wouldn't be here today in this wonderful hall talking about law that relates to human rights and individual rights, because in the past, that was not the issue. Just 100 years ago, that was not the issue. The individual rights was not really the issue. Because the transformation between the kingdom and the empire into a state means that you transform the sovereignty from the ruler to the citizen. Because as a state, you as citizens are in the center, you are the rulers, and the government is serving you. In the kingdoms, you serve the king. So the whole concept of the past was based on different ideas. 150 years ago, and not so many years actually back, in this wonderful democracy of England, if you steal a loaf of bread as a child because you are hungry, you are sent to 7 years in jail in Australia. 7 years old. And if you are 12 years old, you go to the army to fight. So I say that because we have to add context to understand where we come from. We are not coming from a world of the past where the values and the principles and the ideals were the same as today. What is today common practice in the past was the exception. What was common practice in the past, today we consider exception. If we look at Europe of the past, Europe was not a beacon of democracy because Europe was the master of the universe. And if Europe is controlling all the lands of the universe, those who are controlled do not enjoy equal rights. Actually, they enjoy very little rights. And if you go around Africa and Asia in those days, the people who are subjects of the colonies are not exactly in the category of equal rights citizens of the empire. And the term that today is one of the most derogatory terms that you can really imagine, racism. Racism in the past was within the law. And those were the laws of the empires. If you are in the Philippines or in Africa or in India, wherever you are, and if you are in imperial power, the local inhabitants, indigenous or whatever they are under a code of inferior rights by law. And that was not considered immoral, exceptional, or unacceptable. And by the way, those practices are there until the late 60s, until the late 50s of the last century. And that's what I was telling you about before. We don't realize that after World War II, which was the biggest catastrophe in human history, we still have a period of 15 years after where the European powers do not want to give up on their territories in the colonies. Actually, in each and every colony had to fight to get their national independence. Is it agreed? Or anyone wants to challenge me on that? So that is a very interesting idea, that here is the end of World War II, The victors come out of World War II bleeding and, of course, bruised morally and physically. And instead of granting freedom, because all those colonies sent their soldiers to the war, so instead of granting them freedom, they actually go back to the colonies to reclaim the lands. Do we ask the question, who writes history and what is the narrative? This is the context I'm trying to challenge you with. 45 to 60, the European empires are still trying to hold on to Africa. Do I need to remind you India? It was Gandhi and Nehru who had to fight bitterly in order to reclaim what was not the others. But we don't talk this language because it's uncomfortable to mention it this way. So I decided to break away from my traditional ambassadorial position and be a little bit more challenging to you. And perhaps I know that it's a very highly charged term, politically correct, but there is something about political correctness which makes it impossible to tackle the real issues, and we are always dancing around the core because of this conflict. But this discomfort should not be the guiding factor in our understanding of the issue. We can find a different language, but we cannot ignore and we cannot avoid the issue. I say that because in the 50s and early 60s, when European powers were forced to leave North Africa, Asia, and other places, forced to leave, this is the first time I can say that Europe really came to be a democracy. Because up until then, holding on to colonies in Africa and elsewhere, in the Middle East, wherever you go, you may be a democracy at your home, but you are not a real democracy in every sense of it. And we don't talk about those issues. We tend to think that our values of today are really the defining values of our history. And all those people who were racist in the past were bad people. And the good people were always against it. You are absolutely wrong. Absolutely wrong. Racism was an embedded story in the traditions of the old world. And the good people always had racist ideas. They didn't think that they are bad people. But in the real world, racism is bad. And we know that. But we cannot judge the past, we can learn from the past. We can judge it in a sense of learning from it, not by changing it. We cannot change the past and say, oh no, this is a marginal story. So, but practically we were always thinking in those terms, and remember Greece and its democracy. Well, anyone who knows something about the Greek democracy of the past knows something about non-democracy also. So we have to be a bit cautious about those definitions. I say it because now I'm going to challenge you with a bigger issue. If I am trying to shatter you about the past, let me tell you that the nation states also didn't exist in the past. And if you look at the map of history today, and if you look at the map of today, not just history, you are going to see that most of the nation states of the world never existed in history. And that is the issue that we are grappling with and tackling today. This is why we are having so many difficulties in the forging and creating a world order. Because maybe 90% of the states of the world were created by European powers. Now, they were created artificially, because the states of our time do not necessarily reflect a genuine, distinct national identity before. So if you look at the map, and you look at those squarish borders, you have to remember, those borders were not created by the people on the ground. They were created by powers outside. And they came in, they created the borders disregarding the composition, the ethnic and the historical composition of the land. So we can say in a manner of challenge that yes, Land has history, people have history, but not the nations. So can we claim the history of the land and the people for the newborn states? In a manner, yes. That's what we try to do in order to create a world order. That's our job as diplomats, as leaders, and anyone, international, everyone is trying to grapple with this story. That nation states, like, now I'm coming to the Middle East, a nation state like Lebanon, Syria, Iraq, Jordan, Palestine, those nation states never existed in history. Those borders never existed and never reflected a history of distinct indigenous people within those borders. Actually, the people within the borders of today had traditional being on the land and at times also as rivals. If you look at a map today and you ask yourself, where are those rivalries coming from? Africa. There was never in history a state called Kenya or Uganda. So what happened? Libya. Do you know what is the origin of the name Libya? It's from the Roman Empire. It has nothing to do with an Arab history or Islamic history. By the way, the same Lebanon. The same Palestine. Anyone knows what's the origin of the history of the name Palestine? Any guess? Any guess what's the origin of the name Palestine? You should know, by the way. Who said that? You are a historian. David and Goliath, the Philistines. That's the origin of the name. And who gave the name? It's not an Arab name. It's not a Muslim name. It is the Roman Empire, 2,000 years ago, a European empire, who named this land Palestine. So, sometimes when you look at those names, and especially now, we try to create a notion of indigenosity and a long history to the name and the people as one. That's wrong, and that's why we are led to many, many problems in our political arena, especially internationally. Because when you ask yourself, what is really happening in the Middle East, where Lebanon was never a state and never a nation just 100 years ago? So who created Lebanon? Not the people of the Lebanon. There were two guys by the name Sykes and Picot who were kind of negotiating. One was British, one was French. And remember, I was talking about empire. And those empires decided that, time to divide the Middle East after the victory against the Muslim empire of the time. And the Muslim empire of the time was the Ottoman Empire, the Turkish Empire. That was World War I, one of the most stupid wars in human history, and one of the costliest in human history. But that was a war where empires collapsed. And we are talking about Russian Empire, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, the German Empire. These empires collapsed after World War I. And you are here in the Middle East, the two victors, the main victors are the French and the British, and they have now to make sense of this territory that they gained from the Turkish Empire. Remember, during the empire, most of the people of the Middle East, or all the people, they are subjects, they are not citizens of states. They are subjects of the Ottoman ruler who sits in Istanbul, and not citizens of Syria or Lebanon or Jordan who do not exist at that time. So the British are starting to draw borders, and those British and French, and those borders are reflecting the nation states of our time. And the border of Iraq or Syria or Lebanon, they are all artificial borders created by others, not by the people of the land. That includes Palestine. And you ask yourself, there are other names. Jordan is not an Arab name, as you know. Even Syria is not an Arab name, and Lebanon is not an Arab name. Iraq is a name given because of a southern region that was called Iraq. But these are practices that are common in the old world. These are the practices that are bringing the creation of many states in Africa, South America, North America, wherever you go. So we are not talking about an uncommon practice or a bad practice. These are the norms of the time. That's how people and nations and leaders behaved in those days. They didn't think about your human rights, your freedom, or independence. They thought about imperial interests. So the Middle East in those days became a major hub of interest because of the oil. This was the beginning of the oil race in the Middle East. Now, what is so unique about the Middle East that you should know also for yourself, and why it is a global story? Empires have different reasons to go for the plunder. Mostly it's to increase their property and possession. That was also a common practice in the past. If you wanted to be richer, you had to take over the other. You didn't have really the capacity to grow within the existing borders. That was the notion of wealth. You cannot grow beyond a certain capacity. You have to go beyond the borders, take what is not yours, make it yours, and then you are bigger and richer. The Middle East traditionally is the arch rival of the European empires, historically. It was always the conflict and the competition between two empires who always had global aspirations. When you talk about global aspirations, they are defined in a very different way than the aspirations of others. Because the European aspiration and the Middle Eastern aspiration come with two notes, ideology and theology. Both are trying to impose and bring the ideology and theology to every corner of the world. At some point, by the way, Islam almost took over Europe. That was 18th century where the Ottoman Empire almost took the whole of Europe. Spain was Islamic for hundreds of years. And southern France, southern Italy, the Balkans, southern Russia, needless to say, you look at all those Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, they were all Islamic nations because that was the nature of the empire, to push the ideology, theology, of course, the imperial quest. And the Sultan in Istanbul was considered the caliph. We are talking, maybe it's going to now resonate with you on the issue of the caliphate. He was the caliph in the eyes of all Muslims, because the Muslims of the Middle East didn't consider themselves nationals. They considered themselves as subjects of the empire. They didn't think that they are Lebanese or Syrians or Iraqis. None of them, because those names never existed, and they didn't even think that this is going to be the evolution into statehood. They thought that they are Muslims, they are Arabs or others, but subjects of the empire. So if you look at Asia, very serious push all the way to this region. I'm talking about Malaysia, Indonesia, and all others. So you see the spread of the idea, which took over, the world. And you see South America, North America. It was always a combination of the ideology, theology, and there is another note that unfortunately was always accompanied with those conquests, is racial and moral supremacy. That is the disease that came with the whole idea of supremacy. That disease, by the way, of supremacy led to the catastrophe of World War II. And you should know what was the difference between World War I and World War II. World War II marks the first time in history that a continent that was considered an enlightened continent, an enlightened nations, is going to war because of a racial supremacy and megalomania. That's the difference between all other wars. And that's why it's so sensitive until now in Europe. Whenever you talk about Nazism, you don't talk about the results of the war, namely how many people were killed, but why those people were killed. Because genocide, unfortunately, are the marks of human nature and human history. But never before a nation, and not just that nation, went to war in order to eliminate and annihilate other people in the name of a racial ideology. That is the big difference. Nazi Germany adopted a code that appointed the Aryan nation as the supreme race, and in the name of that code, it went to conquer lands and eliminate people and literally annihilate them. Never happened before in history. And that's when people ask me, what's the difference? Remember, that's the difference. And that's why it's so sensitive. And the lessons of European history is really there. And that's when you see the enormous sensitivity until now, that everything that is going wrong, you start immediately shouting, Nazis, Nazis. Which means, warning, warning. Those are the warnings. And we have to be very careful about marginalizing those issues, because we see the rise of very similar ideas that are now coming with the other side of the flip side of the coin. I said that was the conflict traditionally between East and West. When I say East, is the Middle East as an imperial power that really had global reach and global aspiration. Against it, you see Western power, as we call them today, also with the same ideas of global reach, global aspiration. And this supremacy code is unfortunately infecting both sides. We have to, infected both sides. Luckily, we learned a lot in the last 55, 60 years, mostly since the end of colonialism. And when we are asking ourselves today, what is really happening in the Middle East? The Middle East is marked today by nation states who have a very artificial history of states. As yesterday Mr. Obama was in Arabia, Saudi Arabia, by the way, is named after a family, the Saud family. Saudi Arabia, the Arabia of the Saud family. So that gives you another indication where we come from. The Gulf states, none of them have history of states. They were all trophies and gifts by the imperial powers of World War I, two ruling families of the day who helped the victors of the time, the British and the French. So we are now coming to the story of the Middle East, understanding, yes, we have a challenge, which is our past. Because this past was not marked by long history of states. And when you don't have a long history of states, you don't also have a cohesive identity, national identity, and the breakdown of states is possible. And you see it, by the way, in Europe, but in an amicable way. Czechoslovakia, the Czech and the Slovaks decided about 20 years ago to say goodbye. And they are now called the Czech Republic and the Slovakia. The Balkans disintegrated because of that. So you see a lot of tensions between the old and the artificial or the modern. Spain is having its troubles with Catalonia and others. Wherever you go, you have those tensions. Those are natural tensions because the modern statehood is not so natural. And those are the natural tensions in the Middle East as well. And in order to go into what we call the prospects and what are the hopes, going back in time, it's the worst thing and the worst case scenario. Because going back in time, it's not going back to the good old days, but to the nightmare. Well, normally I say there are no good old days except those that were we very young and we had a good time. But as children, and as young, we don't really see the whole picture around us, and we are in our own little bubble, and we enjoy life, whatever it is. But when you're an adult, you see that the world is having shades. It's not black and white, and we have to make sure that we understand those. Now, to come to a point where I can really open it to a discussion, and a challenging discussion, I just want to say that what you see today is very much haunting winds of the past that are coming back to kind of challenge us in the present. And what you see with ISIS and similar things is really the idea that, or the ideal, that they can bring back the past in their own version, which is the caliphate. They are really calling it the caliphate. So the reason for that is that the unfortunate thing is the evolution of the nation states in the Middle East. Most of those nation states in the Middle East never delivered on a promise of a state. And what I said before, the state is about government who serves you. Most of the states in the Middle East don't have this stage where the government serves the people. Because most of the states in the Middle East are still rotating between two corners, theocracy and autocracy, not democracy. And the evolution into democracy is a matter of time. And 50, 60, 70 years of evolution is a very short time in history in order to forge a state that never had before an evolution into state, because it came from outside. And when the national identity was created by foreign powers from outside, the inside is going to take much more than the natural evolution of states who were evolving from inside. Take Europe. Most of the states of the European continent evolved from inside, not from outside. They were the imperial powers. So if we are looking at this rotation between theocracy and autocracy, we may understand better what are the real issues in the Middle East, or as I call it, the Middle East. Talking about my little country in the Middle East, which is always in the middle of this Middle East, I can say that we always joke about it, that Israel offers never a dull moment. And if there is a dull moment, we make sure to change it. That's my always promise to a journalist. I say that Israel is also the story of Israel and the Palestinians, which again, it's a very artificial name, a very artificial idea, but in the context of our global community, it is very much reflected as a kind of indigenous struggle of people of indigenous roots. This is again has to be checked very carefully, and because the merits are very slim in this particular issue. And again, here we have a big issue of what is the difference between the possession of your personal land or communal land and the possession of the national land if the nation ever existed before. That's a very interesting issue. Because since when, the nation has the possession over the land if it didn't exist as a nation before? And that's different between, as law students, very different between your personal possession over land that is given to you by the ruler, not by your elected leader. And that was the nature of the Middle East until the 40s, especially Palestine. We had the Turkish Ottoman Empire, we had the British, and the British came to Palestine not because anyone invited them, because they wanted to be there as good empires. So until 1948, which is almost 69 years ago, right? No, that's 67 years ago. I'm kind of rushing time. Today's 2006, 68 years ago. Until 1948, we have a chapter in our history where the British Empire is the owner, or in a sense, is the manager of the territory called Palestine. This territory was created by the British Empire. The borders were created by the British Empire, not by the people of the land. However, the borders reflect some sort of a history of the land, which is, first of all, the Israeli Jewish history. This was the Holy Land. This was the birthplace of monotheism. And, of course, the people of the land who used to live there. Right? So, however, the population of the past and the picture of today is very different. And if I challenge you about populations of our time in countries like Europe, 4 million, 4.5 or 5 million, you can imagine the early 20th century, you have like a few 100,000 people on the land, not millions. Today, altogether, between the Jordan River, which is the east, and the Mediterranean, if you have a picture of that, we have around 12 million people. 100 years ago, it was around 400,000. So these are the changes that are taking place, and very important to know them, because by and large, the evolution of population is through natural growth and settlement. So if you are a subject of the Turkish Empire, and you are a Christian or a Jew, or of course a Muslim, you are eligible to buy land. If you reside in Damascus, you are eligible to buy land also in Jerusalem. Because there are no borders, and there are no passports, and there are no different laws and different rules, only the rules of the Sultan. He is the landlord. And this is really the evolution of population. People buy and settle and move, not as indigenous people, but rather as inhabitants of the area. And you could buy land anywhere you want. So until 1948, we don't even have the issue of ownership, because the ownership was legitimate. Where each and every side has its own, what we call, deed. After 48, we have serious issues. Actually, the lead up to 48 is a very serious issue where the wrong twist of nationalism in the Middle East is taking all of us into wars. I don't know if I want to go into that right now, but I will be happy to answer a challenging question on that. So I would like to stop here and tell you, yes, think now a little bit differently about root origins of conflicts. Think a little bit very differently about the issue of citizenship, subjects, freedom, independence, human rights, where we come from, where we go to. Because if you don't know where we come from, you may take for granted your freedom of our time and your natural environment of our time, and you think that this is it. That's how it was, and how it should be. And that's as a last anecdote. We are always talking about women's rights and women's rights to vote, the suffrage. Men also didn't have suffrage in the 19th century. You should know that. Because the democracy of the 19th century, which was not so much a democracy, was based on aristocracy, not on equal rights. So most of the men didn't have suffrage in England and elsewhere, because to vote in England or Europe was a question of your rights. As a landlord, as property owner, and things like that. That was an aristocracy-based idea. That's something as an anecdote. And I stop here for your questions, and thank you very much for listening to my very provocative ideas.
Ambassador, I was just wondering, because I've been reading on international news recently, and it really revolves around the ISIS in the Middle East, and they seem to be expanding their territory not only in the Middle East but also in Africa. Israel seems to be well protected by this expansion, and also I was just wondering, how long do you think will it take for this conflict to be resolved? The expansion of the ISIS territory, and they're planning to regain the caliphate, and how is Israel protecting itself from the ISIS invasion?
I thank you very much for the credit you give me to give you all the answers of how the future is going to look like. But I can tell you that I don't have the capacity to profess very easily. Prophecy is although I'm coming from the Holy Land, but prophecy is not my strength. Evaluation is my better, and you have a very good question about the story of ISIS. ISIS is, as I said, it's an ideology. It's a movement. If we are going to belittle it into groups or some individuals doing something wrong, we are leading ourselves into a very bad choice. And that comes on the backdrop of what I started to talk about, the issue of the ability of nation states to grapple with different ideas of government and governance. And what we call, if the past was marked by the idea of ruling in the name of God, our present is ruling in the name of the people. However, we have plenty of entities who are still trying to rule in the name of God. And ISIS is one of those movements who is trying to restore the glory of the past, where the rulers were ruling in the name of God. So what you see is indeed a spread of an idea. Killing ideas, destroying ideas, eliminating ideas is a very, very hard process. And you don't have guarantees for success if the people don't define the problem. Defining the problem is 50% of the solution. But right now, out of all kind of political bickering and political, I would say, rivalries in the most powerful nations, among the most powerful nations of the world, people don't really like to define the problem because it evokes all kind of sentiments that nobody wants to touch. As I said before, it's about the racism of the past. That was the trademark of many of the nations who are now struggling with the story, and some other associated elements. But we have to remember the danger is there. Europe is now facing a big challenge. And I think it's a big challenge to democracy. Because the foundation of democracy, and that brings me to just an aside that adds to your question. The foundation of democracy is the unity that is defined by the coexistence of differences. That's the real idea behind unity, the coexistence of differences. That is in total contrast to the idea of non-democracies, which is uniformity. One position, no opposition, and we kind of always mistake uniformity with unity, as if we all sing the same, we are united. We are unified, not united. And therefore, the whole idea of a modern nation state is about unity, the coexistence of differences within the rule of law, where the individual is recognized as the sovereign, not the ideology, not the theology. ISIS represents that challenge, and the Middle East has a lot of what we call pockets and many entities that are enchanted by this idea because of the nature of things, the nature of human conditions in the Middle East or elsewhere. And when you look at the human conditions in the Middle East, it's not something to be proud of. And that's why I'm saying it's a very dangerous story. Actually, in many ways, if we don't pay attention to the issue, we are going to see a major blow against democracy. We can see it, by the way. We can see also the recent campaigns in many countries that are provoked and evoked around the same story of the exclusive identity, not the inclusive identity. And we discussed it just a few minutes ago, that a democracy is about inclusive identities, not exclusive identities, and it's really something that you should search and be aware and understand it. What's the difference between those two? Because if the fellowship between citizens is going to collapse and citizens of one religion are going to kill their fellow citizens of another religion because of a conflict far away from the borders of their country, there is no way that democracy can survive. Because democracy is eventually a covenant between the people, emboldened by constitution. So if all of a sudden I say that my loyalty is not to my fellow citizens, but rather to people who are fellow religion, that brings in the seeds of disaster to democracy. Because the trust a citizen is going to be lost. And that's not about different cultures, because it's not a cultural issue. By the way, it's not also a religious issue. We have to be very careful between the definition of ISIS as a religious issue. It's not about Islam. It's not about Muslims. It's about an ideology that sweeps the minds of many, unfortunately, and of Muslims. However, that's about ideas, not about a generalized blame. And but here is the difference really. Too much we are talking about Islam, and it's theology. Talk about the people who misinterpret religion and leads to catastrophes, and we had plenty in the past, on both sides. Today we have a phenomenon that is on one side, and if we are not going to contain it, ISIS is going to be a major menace, and the conflicts will be there. Africa, by the way, is very prone to this kind of stories, and that's a danger. Middle East is a danger. And actually, ideologies can crawl and sweep the minds of not all, but you don't need all, to deal catastrophes to our society. So yes, we have a problem. Israel is not in the middle of it, because for ISIS, the first objective is to free the Arab lands and to create the caliphate. So they look at Israel as the second tier. They will come to us. However, I think that the free world and the sober world is starting to begin to it's not so simple. We have to inject some resources. I look forward to a very interesting time of challenges, and I think even the United States, that at the beginning was a bit reluctant and very kind of soft on the issue, is now beginning to understand that that's not about marginal or marginalized, but about real issues.
What is Israel's position in the rising tensions in the Middle East due to the drop in oil prices? Because my family lives in the Middle East, so we've been experiencing problems because especially with the deliberate dropping of oil prices in certain countries, and it's creating much tension in the Middle East right now. And especially another question would be in terms of the Arab Spring. So since there are certain countries in the Middle East who have experimented with the idea of democracy and the rule of the people, but now in recent time, most of these countries are starting to realize that they're not necessarily enjoying the aspects of democracy as they thought.
About the oil prices, I think that you are looking at Philippines and Israel on in two different corners. Because for the Philippines, it's really a matter of loss of jobs in the Middle East. The drop of oil prices can affect the local economies, and it's already affecting them. But I can say that in the Gulf area, the good news is that they are going through an adaptation to modern economies for quite some time. So when you look at the Gulf today, Dubai ports and the Emirates, and you see, really a rise of a genuine economy, not just an oil-based economy. So I don't think that they will be as affected as maybe others. I'm talking the commodity-based countries that are not just in the Middle East. Look at Russia. Russia is heavily affected. Look at the Russian economy and what's happening in the outskirts. It's a very serious issue. Israel, in that sense, Israel is a beneficiary because Israel is a very modern economy. So for us, lesser prices means, better deals and cheaper. Everything becomes cheaper in a sense. And mind you that I used to pay $2 plus per liter per liter of gasoline. Today I pay like 1.2. So that's, I mean, a major benefit for Israelis. Now there is a difference. There is a difference between the reaction of different countries, and you can see it also, of course, European countries, Western countries. Modern economies will be less affected, of course. Less efficient economies will pay a price. But you know, when in times of challenge, this is also the time of opportunity. So I think that we all as leaders, especially political leaders, have an obligation now to look into the restructuring that is required and not to put all eggs in one basket. The second question was? Well, as I said, I was trying to lead you to the whole story of the Arab Spring and the birth of nations. The Arab world is a very young and fledgling world. It's still struggling with its national identity because it never had national identity before. And I didn't see an Arab Spring when I saw the first eruptions. Because for me, the formula of rotating between theocracy and autocracy was a very dominant way of looking at the Middle East. And you could see that the most significant consideration in the Middle East was not, the well-being of the people, but the well-being of the regime. We have to understand that. Until now, the issue is always the well-being of the regime, not the people. So if you threaten the regime, then hell breaks out. Syria is a very good example. Iraq was an excellent example. But go nation state by state and you're going to see that the well-being of the regime is still the first and foremost criteria. Iran, the regime. Libya was regime. Morocco is regime. So there are those fundamentals. Jordan. And I don't think that at present I have the right to challenge those regimes in the way Western nations are trying to challenge them, because I think that we may bring more havoc than stability. But this is for this room. Outside I say something else. I say it because it's very important for us to understand it. Stability is for us, and this stage of life of the nation states of the Middle East is sometimes rather more important, because we cannot achieve what a media society likes to present before us. We are a media society, which means every problem of today has to be fixed by tomorrow, because tomorrow we have a new newsreel and we have to tell the people, yes, yesterday problems was solved. But you cannot solve problems in one day. And this immediacy of the demand is not there. You cannot do that. And what took European nations 200 years, you cannot expect from others to be in 50 years, especially since, and they didn't have the evolution into statehood as the Europeans had. That part you have to remember. Europe had the worst wars in human history, not the Middle East, not Asia, not Africa. The worst wars in human history are on the European continent for 200 years, until they became to be the European Union and the glory of our time. Today they can be very proud. They cannot be so proud about the past. So that's what I'm saying. It's not about defamation, but it's about facts. So if you create nation states, give them the time to evolve, help them to avoid the mistakes of the past. This is very important, and that's why I'm talking about the global community, the United Nations, making sure that we don't repeat the mistakes of the past.
As a nation, sir, what is the role of Israel to prevent or suppress the ISIS situation, and how could the other nations help it?
You're asking a very interesting question, because that's real politics, not the kind of, I was taking you to 30,000 feet, brought you down to 10, now we are down to earth. It's okay, we are landing. You have to remember that we have a common interest, very serious common interest today with most of the nations of the Middle East around us. In particular, Jordan, the Gulf states, Saudi Arabia, Egypt. We are all in the same boat, facing very similar challenges. So that means that instead of investing in symbolism and narratives of who is right and who is wrong in historical proportion, and always dealing with the history of the Bible, I mean, the history of the Israeli-Arab conflict, for some reason some people think that it's from the Bible. So give it 100 years is also enough. But it's also long, by the way. But it's definitely not a biblical conflict. So now they are departing for symbolism and the blame game, or what I call the politics of scapegoats. For dictators, traditionally the best friend is a foreign enemy. Remember that. If you can attach to the foreign enemy all the ills and the evils of your present, I mean, it's perfectly fine. I mean, you have an enemy there, he is to blame. So the blame game in the Middle East goes on, I mean, for God knows how many years. But now, there is no time for blame game. It's real. And therefore, we have a very serious cooperation and with others involved. Now you see that also the superpowers are coming back. The United States, Russia especially. So I think that ISIS is going to face a challenge, especially in his natural habitat in Syria and Iraq. But eventually it's going to be on the shoulders of the nations of the land to tackle this story with the help of others. So with Egypt in particular, we have very close relations because we have also diplomatic relations. Same in Jordan. But it's interesting to see how the alliances are changing to real politics, not imaginary.
You mentioned earlier that in 1948 the British Empire had a mandate over Palestinian territory, and it was also in 1948 where the independence of Israel was declared. And the independence of Israel had the support of the British. And
they actually know. They abstained in the United Nations.
They abstained in the United Nations, sir. But President Truman of the U.S. I believe had sympathy over the plight of your people. So what was the importance of the support of a powerhouse such as the U.S. in your request for independence, and did it affect your relations moving forward up to now, having such relations with the U.S.? Also, Ambassador, what was the importance of your victory in the war that followed in 1948 in your assertion as an independent state? And lastly, what's the importance, would you consider having a strong military presence as an important factor in your assertion as being a state moving forward, since I believe only 80% of the United Nations states, only 80% of the United Nations states actually recognize Israel as the state? Thank you.
Let me say something. You asked me, the first one is about our association with the United States. The United States in 1948 indeed supported the creation of the State of Israel. By the way, when you say creation of the State of Israel, it was a partition plan, namely to create two states. One is going to be an Arab state called Palestine, and one a Jewish state called Israel. That was the support. However, we entered into a very interesting, as I say, the Middle East, not the Middle East in those days, and the idea of the creation of a Jewish state, non-Arab, non-Muslim, was an anathema for the Arab League at that time, and that became a Middle Eastern conflict, not a conflict of the peoples of the land, but rather a conflict between the Jewish component of the land called at that time Palestine, because by the way, Jews also were called Palestinians until 48. So that was the story where the invasion of Arab armies into the promised national land to the Jewish entity was the Arab states tried to halt it and to reverse it. That is the beginning of the real conflict. Until 48, it is a conflict of communities within the borders of the so-called Palestine. The United States was very crucial in the vote. And in general, remember that the world of those days is dominated by the superpowers and those who created the world order, which Philippines is also privy to. We were all privy to that, the dominance of those superpowers, because that was already the Cold War era. And the name of the game is, who do you associate yourself with? And that was not so easy. It was not that you had so many choices. You're either or. You're either with me or with him. That's where also the non-aligned movement comes in, trying to kind of twist itself in a way to get a little bit of more independence for the newly formed states, who were still under the spell of the colonial powers, very much pulling the strings around everything. And in 1948, most of Africa, and even India, if I'm not mistaken, is not an independent nation. You have to remember those things. So definitely for us, the United States was a beacon of support, without which I don't think that Israel would have been able to really survive in the long run. Because the US, by the way, didn't support Israel militarily. Until 67, between 48 and 67, US imposed an embargo on Israel on the military hardware. So it was not a military support. It was actually an economic support that helped us save the country at the beginning, because as a fledgling state, we didn't have what we have today, a high-tech society with all the industries that you know. It's not an IT society in those days, and not an ICT society in those days. We don't know those terms. We're talking about basic society, very much based on agriculture. So that was very crucial. The second question, remind me, quickly.
Sir, the 1948 war.
As I said, the 1948 war is the product of, unfortunately, the wrong evolution of a promise made in 1920. I'm going to send you back to your, what we call legal documents, and you're going to see something that most people don't talk about. In 1920, the League of Nations, that was created as what we call the international body after World War I, what we call the equivalent of the United Nations to follow. In 1920, the League of Nations is giving a mandate, not a colony, is giving a mandate to the British Empire to create a Jewish homeland in Palestine. People say, really? That the document is there. It was the design from the very beginning to create a Jewish homeland. Now, interestingly enough, Palestine in those days was defined by two sides of the Jordan River, which the Kingdom of Jordan today and what will become also Palestine later. Those two territories were designated as a homeland for the Jewish people. Right after, the British Empire took the mandate and divided the land. That's why we have the Kingdom of Jordan that was called the Kingdom of Transjordan. Namely, the mandate of the Transjordan became the Kingdom of Jordan, and one became the mandate of Palestine. However, the British Empire had second thoughts, and that we call realpolitics. Over time, they were shifting alliances and loyalties. So the British slowly kind of abdicated and tried to avoid, the fulfillment of this UN the League of Nations promise. That is the reason why we had the conflict. That's the main reason. There was a contention. Of course, there was a conflict within the communities that would have been resolved, by the way, if it was left for the communities, Arab and Jews living in Palestine, there would be a two-state solution in 1948. But since it became a regional conflict, a symbol and a narrative that is much bigger than the conflict, it became also a symbol and narrative to the United Nations over time, the issue is much more murky and much more complex. So, yes, 1948 is a departing point, and indeed, it's a beginning of what we call a regional conflict that has the spillover all over the world. The third one was?
The third one is the importance of militarism and assertion of your identity.
Look, we have a hope and a dream of peace. But in order to have peace, you have to have security. With all due respect to ambitions and ideals and everything that we are going to invest in the civilian side, you cannot avoid the necessity of the security dimension, because you never know what may happen, and we are still the United Nations, not the United World. And this is something that you have to remember. We are confusing so many times the ideals of the United Nations as a united world. We are not the united world. We are a United Nations with sovereignty as still a cherished idea, not just, a whole united territory. That's why we are global and global. Thank you.
I'd like to ask specifically, what is the current relationship between Israel and Palestine, and how are they moving forward?
Well, I tell you, this is the next lecture. Do I have time for another one? Oh my, you are giving me a... Look, I would say that the Israeli-Palestinian, when I say Palestinian, it's indeed the Arabs of the land that used to be called British Mandate Palestine, is a tragedy. It's a tragedy because it was kept as a source of, as a symbol of animosity within the Middle East and beyond. Today, when you say Palestine, you refer to, there are so many associated ideas and symbols that are coming with it. It's human rights, it's about colonialism. Everything is immediately connected to that because we are talking about symbolism and a narrative. In order to go into the real story, eventually we are talking about real people and real life who are living on the land. And you have to find accommodation to the desires of individuals and a desire to create another nation called Palestine, Arab Palestine. So there are two things here. As one is the life of individuals and the life of a nation. To address those issues, Israel was trying to create a new bridge. And 20-something years ago, we signed an agreement which was almost an impossible idea for most of the leaders of the world, and we didn't do it, under the pressure of the United Nations. We signed an agreement with the PLO, which was the Palestine Liberation Organization, an organization dedicated to the destruction of the state of Israel. But in 1993, we signed an agreement with them to lead gradually to a Palestinian self-rule entity, which may develop into a statehood. I don't think that our experience in the negotiation is very positive. We had ups and downs of many, and definitely the issue of accepting Israel as a Jewish state. When I say Jewish state, you have to remember the Jewish state is not for the Jewish religion. The Jews are first and foremost a people, not a religion. This is something most people don't understand. And anyone knows where the name Jew comes from. Judah, the kingdom of Judah, is the origin of the name Jew. Namely, we are not named after a religion, we are named after a kingdom. It's a peoplehood, not a religion. It's a peoplehood with a unique religion. That was, by the way, very unique also in the past. It's the cradle of monotheism. So now you are talking about a Jewish state, mainly the national homeland of the Jewish people, not the Jewish religion. And this is very, very difficult for the Arab side to accept and to recognize and say, this is where we go as a solution. At this stage, we are still in a very murky situation. I don't see how we are going to come out of it, although there are formulas to move on. But that requires leadership and not politicians. You know, what's the difference between a politician and a leader? A leader creates new futures, a politician trying to manage the existing one. So we have to be very careful about that, and we don't have the leadership that is going to take the Palestinian people to new horizons, because they have to stop with the notion of victimhood. This is a struggle about titles. Who is the victim? Victimhood, the title of victimhood is the most cherished title in the Middle East, which gives you the rights and gives you the privileges and everything, and that's wrong. I can tell you that Singapore is 5.5 million people on a territory of 600 square kilometers, if I'm not mistaken. Take the Gaza district, which is 500 square kilometers with 2 million people. If they were not busy creating a military foundation for war against Israel, they could have done another Singapore. That's the difference, because there is not a single Israeli in the Gaza. But the intention, the philosophy, the ideology is what we look at. And we have in the Middle East this notion that you know that I know that you know that I know. So don't, you know. This thing is going to be the last one.
Good morning, sir. Sir, so as we seek a solution to our conflict, for you, what would be the best case scenario as a solution and the worst case scenario, and how each scenario would affect the Philippines?
Are you talking about the Philippines as your conflict?
The solution to the conflict in the Middle East, the best case and the worst case, and how each scenario would affect the Philippines.
I tell you, in principle, the best case scenario is always a peaceful scenario. There are no other scenarios. In the long run, you have to coexist. And that scenario is already there because we signed on a principal agreement on a two-state solution. That part cannot be implemented because of local forces. And as long as I have traditional, semi-religious, semi-national ambitions on the Palestinian side, called Hamas or Jihads and all the fancy names that are preaching basically exclusive rights for the Arabs of the land and kicking out the Jews of the land, there will be no accommodation. And that's what I say, you know that I know that you know that I know. We know the language of one another, we understand where to go, and we ignore the noise. As we say, in a good media society, we have to learn to ignore or how to discern between the noise and the voice. So yes, in the Middle East, you have to know how to discern between the noise and the voice. But I don't think that the Arab-Israeli conflict is really the issue for the Philippines. It's a much broader issue. The notion of victimhood, historical victimhood of the Middle East, that they were deprived of their so-called traditional glory. I call it the deficit of dignity in the Middle East is the driving force that can bring the ISISes and others to every corner of the world in the same tradition of the past. Namely, trying to reach out to the world to bring the truth or to bring whatever truth they call it. These are the movements who are trying to bring the past back. And instead of bringing back the golden age of Islam, they will bring us the nightmare of the dark ages of Europe. This is the difference. I mean, they are not talking about the golden age of Islam. So I see this is the issue. So Philippines and the issue of Palestine, that's not the issue. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Ambassador, for the good lecture. And thank you to everybody who asked questions. We'd just like to present you with a small token that Dr. Andes and Dean Candelario will present to you.
Oh.
75 years.
Oh my God.
Yeah, that's 5 years or 100.
Thank you.
And now, just before we go, some closing remarks from our dean.
His Excellency, Sir Ambassador Ephraim Ben Matityau, our Vice President for the Professional Schools, Dr. Antoinette Palma Angeles, the members of the delegation from the Israel Embassy and staff, welcome. Our esteemed guests, my colleagues at the law faculty, and beloved students of the law. Mr. Ambassador, please accept our sincerest expression of gratitude and appreciation for the generosity of time and commitment this morning. This morning's session contributed, I'm sure, immensely to our students' knowledge and understanding of a very fundamental problem in international relations today, which continues to challenge various international stakeholders. Our own country, as a member of the community of nations, desires, in all honesty, a definitive solution of the problem you just have mentioned, particularly in your region. It is to the interest of all freedom-loving people to live in peace side by side with each other. As you are most aware of, we have our own share of challenges as a nation, with a relatively diverse composition of ethnic groups, at least 112 ethnic groupings in this country, including the core indigenous communities in the Cordilleras and also Muslim Mindanao. We continue to observe and obtain good practices. I hope we could learn from your practice, but probably with the longest time of negotiations I've seen, and I was once a negotiator for both the CPP-NPA NDF process with government and for a time with the More Islamic Liberation Front, we have been trying to look for formulas in our own domestic setting. And one time I was in Oslo, Norway, during the talks with the CPP-NPA, and I saw the place where you had signed an agreement, no? At the time. And that was a long time ago. And we're also in the same boat right now, trying to resolve. But hopefully, practices in the past could, as we said, not just be judged on the basis of what transpired, but as forward-looking mechanisms for us to learn from. Let me assure you that our prayers go with your efforts in resolving your regional issues and concerns. And in the near future, please do not hesitate to engage us, and we are very thankful for you having approached us to deliver some of the sessions. And we will try to continue with these constructive conversations. You have, to a certain extent, I think, placed a great deal of interest on this topic. Our students have already finished the chapter on legal personality and matters of statehood. I can guarantee you that they are within the radar screen, and they have, I'm sure, been able to grasp the difficulties of understanding the development of nation states today. But thank you very much. You have been most ambassadorial in the sense that you have opened conversations in a non-diplomatic manner. That's the conversation I think we need in this kind of forum. Thank you for all the honesty that you have shared this morning.